Dr. Rod Girl is a Queenslander who has returned after 20 years at the University of Auckland, New Zealand to become an honorary researcher at the University of Queensland, his home university. He is a philosopher specialising in logic and artificial intelligence. Rod's books have been the standard text used for teaching logic in Queensland high schools since the 1970s. So, welcome, Rod. Can you tell us something about the relationship between ideas like knowledge and belief and how we might better understand them?
Well, there are contrasts between knowledge and belief, and these contrasts are very interesting. Knowledge on the one side is very objective. Belief is very subjective. Knowledge is something that can be shown to be false. If someone says, I know something, then you can show that they didn't know it if what they said turns out to be false. They didn't really know it. The second thing about knowledge is that when someone says they know something, they're giving a kind of promise. I give you my promise that this is true. Now, with belief, it's quite different. With belief, if someone says, I believe something, even if it's false, they might still quite correctly say they believe it. And the only way to show that what they said is wrong is to show that they're not genuine, that they've told lies, or something like that. So there's a really strong contrast between them. There's another big contrast also. It's a kind of social contrast between knowledge and belief. With knowledge, the automatic question that people ask is, how do you know? And the answer to that should explain how the other person can get to know the same thing. With belief, the automatic question is, why do you believe that? And then the person gives their reasons. And even if their reasons are not strong, even if the reasons don't add up, they might still believe it. And as I said before, unless they're lying or they're just being insincere, we can't question that. So saying you believe something, you set up a defensive barrier. Well, all I said was I believe it. But with knowledge, there's no defensive barrier. So if what they said turns out to be false, then they lose something. They lose their authority, they lose their status as a knowledgeable person. But the believer doesn't lose their status so long as they're genuine. So there's a big social contrast between them. In fact, the difference overall is very social. You can't imagine Robinson Crusoe on his island going around saying, I know this, I believe this, I know that, because he's not talking to anyone until Man Friday arrives. So knowledge and belief place a person's statements in a social context.
So how then can we understand the concept of reasoning towards belief or reasoning towards the creation of knowledge?
Well, with knowledge, it has to be almost provable. So if someone says, how do you know that? How do you know that there's a spring of water at the foot of that hill? The person who says, I know there's a spring of water, they have to come up with the goods. They have to say, well, I went there and I saw the spring. Now that's pretty ironclad. So in a way, there's not a great deal of reasoning, except they must answer the question correctly. One of the important things in reasoning is to understand a question and answer the question properly. So in that case, it's answering the how do you know question properly. With belief, that's quite different. Why do you believe? Then you have to marshal your reasons. And those reasons are supposed to support. They don't have to actually prove, but they have to give good support. Say a jury, it has to be beyond reasonable doubt. In everyday life, it's not as tight as that, but people have to get their reasons straight. And that's one of the things that philosophers and logicians in particular are really interested in, is the relationship between the beliefs that people claim they have and the reasons they give. So there's the two different questions. You have to use your reason to answer the questions correctly.
You've spoken about belief and knowledge in quite different ways. Is there an overlap between the two?
The orthodox view is that there's a big overlap, that knowledge is a special kind of belief. And that attitude to knowledge goes back 2,500 years to Plato. Of course, Plato believed that human beings didn't know anything. They only had opinions. And the only way to get belief was to remember all the things you discovered between your death and your reincarnation. I don't mean to put down the view for that reason, but knowledge as a special kind of belief has a long tradition. What I'm doing is saying no, there is effectively no overlap. People will say, I don't just believe it, I know it. And then if they are shown to be incorrect, they didn't really know it, your response is, well, you didn't know it, you only believed it. So I think there's a big social contrast between them. It's a knockdown question with knowledge. If someone knows something, they'll know it only if it's true. So we can always check knowledge by doing experiments, by tracking down their how did they know this, and if it doesn't pay off, no, you don't know it. You can't do that with belief. So if knowledge is a special kind of belief, you should be able to just give reasons, and if the reasons are strong enough, then you know. But I think the social dimension is that when someone says, I believe something, they're putting up a little bit of insurance. They're saying, well, if I get it wrong, don't blame me. I didn't give my word.
What would you see as the role of doubt with those two ideas, belief and knowledge?
Doubt is absolutely important with knowledge, because if you don't think the person knows, then you have a target, and the target is you just show that what they said they knew is false, and they don't know. It's as quick as that. So doubt is very important in knowledge, and the philosophers of science will say that in science, doubt has a special place, because any theory is always open to being doubted and tested. There is nothing absolutely fixed in science. But with belief, it's quite different. You can say you doubt a person's belief, they might just continue believing because they have this fixed idea. You might then say, well, your reasons are no good. And they might still say, but I believe it. I still believe it. So belief is less vulnerable when you come to doubt.
You could doubt that you know something, but you couldn't doubt that you believed something.
No, unless the person's lying or they're insincere. Yes.
What do you think is the way in which knowledge or belief are socially constructed as opposed to individually constructed?
They're constructed within a society in order to establish some kind of hierarchy, because some people know things and others don't. And if someone knows it and they can explain how you can learn it or how you can also get to know it, then that raises them in the social area. They get promoted as the person who knows where the springs are, the person who knows how to fix your motor car, the person who knows how to search the internet. With knowledge comes promotion. With belief, the person puts their belief out, but they have this reservation. And if the belief is widely accepted, then maybe they'll get a boost. If the belief is doubted by most people, then they still believe it. They're still where they were. They don't get demoted. People will often say they have very strong beliefs. And that is a defence. That's a defensive line. So if they have very strong beliefs and we just don't agree with them, we'll say things, well, fair enough, but I don't agree.
Do you think most of the ideas about the world we have in our heads individually could count as knowledge, or are they most often beliefs?
I think most of the stuff that we have in our heads we're completely unaware of, and there's a distinction often drawn between the automatic things that we know, the automatic things that we do, that we're not even aware that we do. It's the old story, if you're walking along the street and you focus on how your feet are moving, you're almost bound to stumble because you've stopped doing it automatically. You know how to walk, that's automatic. You know how to pick objects up off the ground. You don't have to think about them. There's a tiny minority of stuff of which we're aware. And that's the stuff where we start testing. Do we really know it? Do we just believe it? How certain are we? And quite often that's brought to our attention because our automatic responses and our automatic knowledge doesn't work. It suddenly runs into an obstacle. You're walking down the street and you trip. So you immediately become aware that something's gone wrong, and you look around, oh, it was one of the tiles in the paving had the corner up in the air a bit. So you forget about that. But there may be other things that happen that just don't work, and it's drawn to your attention. That's when you have to start thinking about whether you know things, whether you believe things. If you think, well, I don't really know this, I only believe something, what are my reasons? Then you have to start working it over in your thought. And that's a very small minority of what goes on in our heads, I believe. And I think there's a large group of cognitive scientists are coming to this conclusion at the moment also. Most of what we do, we're completely unaware of.
So that dual system of thinking.
Yes, there's two layers.
Yeah.
And sometimes when people are asked how do they do something and they start thinking about it, they'll often get it wrong because they don't understand what's going on.
Well, that's an interesting distinction, the difference between knowing how and knowing that something.
Yes.
And I guess they're both knowledge.
Yes.
In your category, are they both the same kind of
Yes.
knowledge in that they can be shown to be true or false?
Yes. Well, in the knowing how case, people can be apprenticed or they can learn a particular skill. Knowing how is very much about skills, and the level of skill that people have. They can be novices, they can be competent, or they can be really expert. Take the driving of motor cars. The people with the L plate, they're the novices. And the people who have no plate at all, well, you think, well, they're competent. And then there are the experts who drive the cars in the races and things like that. The people who drive the cars in races, they don't think about how they're doing it, they just do it. And most of us who drive a car, as soon as you start thinking about what you're doing and what gear am I in and things like that, your level of competence drops. So you can train people to know how to do things, how to wire up a house, again, how to search the internet and so on. So someone just sits down, they're an expert, they just do it. They're not thinking about which key do I press, they're not thinking about that, they just do it.
And they just know.
They just know how to do it. And if they say, I know how to do it, and you say, okay, sit down and search for this, and they make a mess of it, then you say, well, you don't really know how to do it, do you? Because they made a mess of it. Again, knowing how has this test. Did they actually accomplish what they said they knew how to do?
Right, nice.
So it's quite important, that distinction.
Could you say then from your description that it's possible to promote belief to knowledge and to demote knowledge to belief?
Yes, definitely. You can demote knowledge to belief if you can show that the person didn't really know it, because they can't show you how. They can't provide a proof for the mathematical theorem that they said they knew. They can't give you the simple instructions that you need to go and get the same knowledge. So you can say to them, well, you didn't really know it. It was just your opinion. Then you change the nature of the question and answer. You say, now, what were your reasons? And then the person starts to think about what persuaded them to make this claim.
It seems like, from what you're saying, that sometimes you can know things and not know you know them.
Yes.
Because you haven't yet had them verified or been able to verify them. But you can falsify them.
That's right.
So inductively, we might find ourselves in something of a limbo for a while until we can deductively, through, say, falsification, show that something is not the case.
Yes. When people say they know something, they're placing themselves in an almost perilous situation.
This is the promise you spoke of.
Because they've promised goods. And if they don't show you how to get the same knowledge, then they've failed in their promise. They haven't met up with their promise.
That they could still be right.
They could be right, but we begin to get jittery about it. You see this in the detective stories on TV, where one of the experienced detectives say, I know he did it. And then the superior says, where's the proof? So how do you know it? Oh, I just know it, I've had years of experience. That's not really good enough. They have to show how they actually came to know this, in this case, in this crime.
Does that mean that if you guess knowledge, you can still claim to know it?
No, I don't think so. I think you can say, I guess it, or I'd put my money on it, or I'm quite certain. We have all these qualifications that we can use instead of no. I'm quite certain. It's highly possible. They can even say, I'm absolutely certain. But I can't show you how. So they might be absolutely convinced, but they just don't have that extra little bit of how.
In which case, how can we say that the distinction between knowledge and belief is different from the ancient idea of knowledge being justified true belief, if it's not, doesn't have to be justified?
Well, with justification, when someone says justified true belief, they nearly always mean reasons. There are reasons which will justify the belief. Now those reasons, if they're absolutely conclusive, say in mathematics, then you could say to the person, well, you really know this, you don't just believe it because your reasons prove this, and that's how we get to know it, because you've shown us how to prove it. But mostly, when people believe things, their reasons are not conclusive. Their reasons give very strong support, they hope, or their reasons are just totally wacko, but that's their reasons.
Is it reasonable to make the claim that this distinction is an inductive-deductive one?
I think it runs parallel to that, yes. I think that the deductive proof of things is one aspect of knowing. But you don't have to be quite deductive. If someone says, I know that there's a spring at the head of the valley, then it's not really deduction to take the rest of the group to the spring and show it to them. And you say, well, how did you know? Well, I came up here last night. It's pretty good. You might say, if they came up here last night and saw the spring, then they know there's a spring.
So knowledge can equally come from our senses or
yes.
from our rationality.
Yes. Now, if they said something different, like, I know there's a ghost in this house, how do you know that? I saw this funny object floating in the air, and someone says, oh, no, that was just the curtain waving in the wind. Oh, so they haven't lived up to their knowledge promise, because what's happened is someone has said, your how doesn't really meet the promise of knowledge.
How do you think we've institutionalised these ideas? Are our institutions built correctly around how we understand knowledge and belief, do you think?
That's very tough. You have to know about social relationships and the pecking order in society and the way in which people can advance themselves, promote themselves in society by gaining knowledge, and being able to show everyone else how they know something. With belief, there's not the same kind of promotion up through the ranks of society, because the person is being defensive. They're saying, I believe this. So later on, you can't demote them, as it were. You can say, well, you might believe it, but we don't agree. And in our society, we often, as I said earlier, we often say they have a strong belief. And what we're doing is saying, okay, we're not putting them down, but we're not putting them up either. We're not advancing them. We just acknowledge that that's their belief.
This distinction between knowledge and belief, how do you think we've managed to do this through our rational methodologies, through our collective rationality, for example, through something like science?
Well, with science is quite new in some sense. People have known all sorts of things about the world going back thousands of years, but science tries to systematise this knowledge and make it more coherent. But science does something else. It speculates. A whole lot of data is gathered by someone who's particularly interested in, say, the movement of the planets in the night sky. And they make up stories about how this happens. Nowadays, of course, many of the stories are highly mathematical stories about how this happens. Before they claim to know anything, they have to really put their speculations through a series of tests. And if the speculation survives a series of standard tests, or any test that anyone might think, and the speculation survives all those, then it might be promoted to knowledge because it survives all the tests. And the person can say, well, this is how I know. I've got all this data. There's a pattern in this data. It's a mathematical pattern. And I've checked this out, looked for exceptions, the exceptions that disprove the rule. And then if they just can't find anything, then they'll promote it to knowledge. And in the culture of science, they'll try to get this confirmed as knowledge by publishing it and talking to all their colleagues about it. And their colleagues will do something that philosophers do. They try to test this knowledge by refutation. I think I've got a counterexample. I've got a way of showing that it isn't knowledge because it's not true in every case. Now, this goes on all the time in science. So when someone says the science of X is fixed, they've made a serious mistake about science. Yes, that's scientific knowledge as it is at the moment is very much a social thing. It's very much an agreement after lots of arduous testing, as the medicos do with drugs, as the scientists do with observations of the stars and the planets and the galaxies and so on. So it really has to be tested. It's not as if people are just simply doubting it, they're testing it. And if it survives the tests, then they'll promote it up to knowledge. And the person who did the first lot of tests and did the first speculation will get a Nobel Prize, and so on. And the Nobel Prize is a way of saying, well, this has survived all the tests so far, and this is a really important thing in astronomy or medicine or whatever. Now, this is not something that can go on in all areas of life. For example, you can't do this in ethics. You can't do this in art and aesthetics. You can't do it in the philosophy of music. So this methodology of testing, verifying, proving, and so on is very much a scientific thing. It doesn't go everywhere. So that's very special. At the same time, in the other areas, people can have their theories. The interesting thing is they also get tested by refutation. What about this case? You think all paintings that are good are paintings that have these features. Oops, here's a painting that everyone believes is good. It doesn't have all these features. So what's going on there is you're trying to refute a theory about good painting by providing a painting which doesn't meet all these tests. So in a way, that methodology of testing theories spreads from science into other areas. But it doesn't involve looking through telescopes or putting stuff into test tubes or looking through electron microscopes. It's something conceptual, where the tests are done by reasoning rather than by experimenting.
We've spoken a lot about reason so far. You are a logician. What is the relationship between logic and reasoning?
The relationship between logic and reasoning is very much tied up with belief. The idea has been, for the last 2,500 years since Aristotle, that the way that you back up your beliefs is by providing a set of statements or propositions which will support a particular conclusion, a particular belief. And it's probably true that most of the logicians for the last 2,500 years have focused on the relationship between reasons and beliefs, reasons and the point being made.
A conclusion of sorts.
Yes, the conclusion. And the logicians say, well, you've got premises and conclusion, but let's think of it as reasons and conclusions. Okay, that, I think, is a very, very narrow view of what logic is about. I think that that kind of logic, which absolutely dominates modern logic, is only very loosely related to the reasoning that people do in everyday life. I think that the reasoning that people do in everyday life is in the context of dialogue. It's the backwards and forwards of question, answer, giving reasons, giving commands, and making promises and things like that. It seems to me that the really important thing that's been ignored for a long time is what actually goes on as people reason. After the Second World War, a lot of people were tried for war crimes, and their defence was, I followed orders. They were given commands. And the judges and the jury said, but you made an unthinking response. Get the phrase? Unthinking response. When people are commanded to do something, they have to think. They have to reason. Is this a legitimate command? Should I just do everything I'm told? Well, a lot of people and a lot of logicians never discuss this. They never discuss the relationship between commands that are issued and what people do. And yet that was the focus of the war crimes trials after the Second World War, one of the big focuses. Questions. People are answering questions every day of the week. You log on to your account and you'll get an email asking you to do a survey, and a survey is a series of questions. And how many times have you done a survey and you've thought, I'm being offered options that don't cover all the options? So the people who've framed up that survey don't really understand the relationship between questions and the responses that can be made to questions. That's an area of logic that is beginning to emerge, but very little is known, very little is understood about this. The relationship between commands and the responses is very ill understood. Where do statements, where do questions, where do commands, where do promises go in everyday life? Well, I think standard modern logic is not very helpful.
Well, it only deals with propositions, doesn't it?
It deals with statements, with propositions, with factual claims and those sorts of things. It doesn't deal with questions. I've been doing a lot of work on questions. There is an alternative stream in the history of logic which is about dialogue. It's the stream in which people were asked questions and had to answer questions and give explanations and so on. And this stream of logic has been very much ignored.
A Socratic approach.
It's a kind of Socratic approach to issues. Sometimes philosophers say it's the questions that matter, not the theories. And yet you say, okay, we're going to do a logic course. When are we going to meet questions? Oops, they do the whole course and never meet a question in the whole of the course.
Everything's phrased as statements about the world.
It's all phrased
Socrates is a man,
yes.
All men are mortal, therefore Socrates is immortal. There's no questions or commands.
There's no questions or commands.
Yet we speak in those terms.
That's the kind of direction. It's what's often called demonstrative logic. It's logic where you try to show that a conclusion follows from a set of statements, set of propositions. Okay, what happens when someone asks a question? Well, the first thing that logicians don't know is What's the value of a question? It's not true or false. What is it? And yet we run into them every day. So you can't have the question as a premise of an argument. No, that's not true. In everyday life, questions are the lifeblood of arguments. Now the logicians have protected themselves by saying an argument is a set of premises and a conclusion. Oops, no it's not. Arguments are questions, responses, commands, and some this follows from that. If someone says something and you say to them, why do you think that? Or how do you know that? Then they'll make a response. And they might even come back with a question. And people say, well, you shouldn't come back with a question when a question's asked. Why not? I say, there's a knock on your door. You say, who is it? And they say, is the owner of the house at home? The person repeats, who is it? And they say, oh, we're Channel 7. Go away. Now that's a perfectly rational set of things to happen. Channel 7 wants to know who's in the house. The person in the house wants to know who's asking the question. And when they hear, they don't want to be bothered by a TV channel. They say, go away. That's a command. So we've got a mixture of statements, questions and commands.
And that exchange was not illogical.
It's not an illogical, it's a perfectly logical exchange. What philosophers in the dominating logic tradition like is the person makes a statement and then the question is, why did you say that? And then you get a set of reasons. Now they like that because that falls into the premise conclusion, the reasons conclusion pattern. It pushes the dialogue into that pattern, but I think dialogue is far more complicated. I actually think that Aristotle's original logic was not a premise conclusion logic. This is heresy. I think it was...
Engage, please.
It was a set of rules to rule how a discussion went on. So if someone made a claim and then later made another claim, then you could bring in Aristotle's system to show they'd contradicted themselves. Or if someone made a claim and they were asked to give a reason, then what they said was, well, if this is true and this is true, then that's true. And all of Aristotle's logic is in if-then form. None of it is in premise-conclusion form. That's an interesting fact about Aristotle's logic. And he was involved daily in dialogue and teaching his students how to respond to questions. And in one of his books, he even talks about how to be cunning about asking questions, not to give away your game. Ask this question. Don't be transparent. Get the other person to admit things and then you've got them.
So he was the father of many things, including
Yes.
the practice of law.
Definitely the practice of law, because he was training students who would many times appear in the law courts in Athens. So I think that side of Aristotle has been ignored, and we've been caught up in what's often called the traditional logic, which today has been converted into the logic of mathematics. It's not the logic of everyday to and fro, but quite a lot of people are working at the moment on the logic of to and fro and discussion and answers and commands and promises and so on. So maybe this will develop. This study started in Australia, and at roughly the same time a similar study started in the Netherlands. And neither group of people who are studying to and fro knew that the other was doing it, and then they met by accident about 15 or 20 years later. Oops, we're all doing the same thing. So it's interesting that it was Australia and the Netherlands who revived this approach to logic, logic as dialogue.
Rod, thank you so much for coming along and sharing your heretical insights with us, and for being part of our MOOC on logic and argumentation, albeit in an unconventional way.
Thank you very much.